This episode is brought to you by Microsoft Azure. Turn your ideas into reality with an Azure free account. Get everything you need to develop apps across cloud and hybrid environments, scale workloads, create cloud-connected mobile experiences, and so much more. Discover what you can create with popular services free for 12 months. Learn more at azure.com. That's AZURE.com. And sign up for a free account to start building in the cloud today.
This series contains adult language and depictions of graphic violence. Listener discretion is advised. One thing I really love about producing these weekly episodes is the research I get to do. Last week, I dropped an episode called The Paris Vampire, in which I briefly touched on a French telecommunications service from the 80s called Minitel. I had never heard of it before and had no idea until recently how far ahead technologically France was compared to the rest of the world back in the 80s. Think about it. What were we doing in the 80s that screamed high-tech? I remember my compact disc player came with anti-skip technology, which was pretty cool. I also had one of those 6-disc changers, also nice. And the new camcorders could be used with full-size VCR tapes, so you didn't have to go through the trouble of transferring them or using multiple different machines to rewatch a home movie. Also quite revolutionary. And the first one of my older brother's friends who showed up at the house with a first-gen cell phone. That was cool. Well, you know what they were doing in France? Getting their news online, banking online, making purchases with credit cards online, and, as mentioned, connecting with potential sex partners online. Yes, true story. While we were watching The Breakfast Club and Top Gun and Ferris Bueller's Day Off, the French were riding the leading edge of a technology boom that was blazing the trail and leaving a detailed roadmap for future global connectivity. And how did they do it? They made it free. Welcome back to The Devil Within. You're listening to the Minitel Rosé. There I go again with a lame attempt at French pronunciations. But anyway, in the mid-1970s, state-owned public utility France Telecom had a robust research and development department. They came up with a way to piggyback on the existing telephone lines with the use of a modem to connect the citizens of France visually. All it required was the hardware to access this new technology. France Telecom designed and built a small monitor keyboard combo, which was about half the size of a standard shoebox, and provided them for free to every household with a France Telecom account. Once it booted up, it was pretty self-explanatory. Follow the prompts on the screen, type in your commands, and boom, you're connected to an online digital system that would eventually offer more than 25,000 separate services in a closed system that was administered entirely by France Telecom. The services, as mentioned, including banking, news, weather, stocks. You could also purchase theater tickets and plane tickets. You could fill out tax forms and college applications, hotel reservations, and other various forms of entertainment. As a bone thrown to the major newspapers who feared losing ad revenue if people could just pull up the news, exactly what the rest of the world went through almost 20 years later, France Telecom allowed legitimate news organizations to charge citizens for the news services offered. So now there was a way to make money off this thing, and it exploded in popularity. It was called Minitel, because although we would laugh at the size of the apparatus today, back then it was wildly small compared to what it was able to accomplish for the user. Minitel, or Mini Telecom, is in a way a misnomer because it was in fact a video interface. So, back to what many entrepreneurs saw as a cash cow. How could someone make money off Minitel? Well, much like the United States, freedom of the press is guaranteed under the French Constitution, which means any citizen can claim to be a journalist. well, can be a protected journalist if they can claim that they are providing information and services of public interest. Yes, anyone in France could apply to France Telecom for a Minitel permit as a news organization and start charging fees for their content. Okay, so now we're getting to where the rubber meets the road. What do people want to pay for? News? Sure. Stock prices in real time? Yes. A more convenient way to shop? Yup. Dirty messages typed out for your satisfaction in incredibly specific sex chat rooms? You better believe it. In short order, the most lucrative corner of the Minitel universe was what was dubbed Minitel Rosé, or the pink Minitel. It made millions, probably billions of dollars per year in fees. The pink Minitel was basically hundreds of separate chat rooms where mostly men would type out their deepest, darkest fantasies without the fear of kink shaming and with the promise of anonymity. On the other end were what amounted to call centers, where dozens of people were employed whose sole job was to respond to these missives, which usually had elements of bondage and some level of sadomasochistic interests. Where things got interesting were the free chat rooms that allowed one-on-one contact. Someone looking for an anonymous sex partner could go trolling through these chat rooms as easily as one might stroll through a singles bar. And for those listeners under the age of 30, a singles bar was, well, a bar where single people went to meet other single people to hopefully make a connection, either a one-night stand or something more long-term. For a long time, through the 70s, 80s, and into the 90s, places like singles bars was the best place to find a partner. What the pink Minitel offered was basically Tinder or Bumble or Grindr 30 years earlier. The Paris Vampire knew this all too well in 1994, and that was naturally the best place to find a random person to kill, thereby fulfilling his lifelong fascination with death. But he didn't come up with that idea on his own. Turns out he was inspired by a madman just a few years earlier, a man named Remy Waugh, also known as the Minitel Killer. For clarity's sake, the last name Waugh is spelled R-O-Y, and I'm making an educated guess at the pronunciation based on the great NHL goalie Patrick Waugh back in the 90s. He played for the Colorado Avalanche. Same spelling, and Waugh was of French-Canadian descent, so I think I'm pretty safe here. Anyway, Remy Waugh was born in 1958 and by all accounts was raised in a loving household that provided for his every need. An average student in high school, after graduating he attended a maritime university, studied sailing, and became a local skipper. While in school, he met his future wife, they bought a house in a Paris suburb, and started a family. Remy's wife owned a local bookstore where, when he wasn't sailing, Remy helped run the place. His wife would later assert that Remy was an adoring father to their 2 kids, a generous friend, and a loving husband. When the bookstore began to increase its business, more staff were hired, and Remy's help was no longer needed. Remy suddenly found himself with loads of free time, so he decided he'd throw his hat into the ring of the emerging market of video production, with a focus on promotional marketing campaigns. But Remy didn't really know what he was doing, and the business failed in less than 6 months, and he sank into a depression. He wouldn't get out of bed, and he dealt with his feelings by eating almost nonstop. He went from a trim 160 pounds to almost 300 pounds. And the only other activity he participated in besides eating was using his Minitel console. And he almost exclusively hung out on pink Minitel. It makes sense. It was anonymous. No one could see how badly he had let himself go, and he could create whatever false reality he chose. And then Remy did something that, when discovered, would shock everyone who knew him. Remy decided to take his pink Minitel use to the next level and solicit what's called some rough trade. He had spent time creating bondage and sadomasochistic fantasy stories in some chat rooms and learned how to speak that language. Sometimes he trolled as a submissive, other times as a dominant. His first bite came from a man named Paul Bernard, a 46-year-old who lived with his mother and used the pink Minitel to indulge in his own very real sadomasochistic interests. Paul was a submissive who wanted someone to safely choke him, whip him, and generally abuse him to the point of sexual gratification. Remy and Paul met up on October 11th, 1990. Now realize that up to this point, there exists zero evidence that Remy Waugh had any homosexual or even bisexual inclinations. Still, after a safe word was agreed upon, Remy indulged Paul's requests to be handcuffed and gagged with a scarf. However, once Paul was thusly subdued, Remy crushed his head with a large rock and left him for dead. Remy went back to the pink Minitel, enthralled with what he'd done, with what he'd gotten away with. And he alone knew the reason for his dreadful deed. In less than a week, he had snagged another bite, this time from a Parisian astrologer who went by the name Nathaniel the Magician. Meeting up at his office on October 19th, Nathaniel, who was also a submissive, offered Remy a glass of wine before they got underway. Remy was then instructed to bind Nathaniel's feet and wrists before placing a leather hood over his head. Then he wanted to be whipped and lightly choked. Instead, Remy beat him with a hammer and left him for dead. Another month on the pink Minitel secured another victim, a man named Hughes Moreau. By this point, Remy had a clear modus operandi: bind the victim according to their wishes, then kill them via blunt force trauma to the head. Mr. Moreau was no different. But this time, Remy took it a little further and stole his victim's checkbook and bank cards, with which he bought more video recording equipment, apparently still believing he could make a go of it in the world of video production. Next, Remy would find 32-year-old Bruno Girardon, who was openly looking for a male lover on the pink Minitel. Bruno and Remy made a date, at which time Remy let Bruno know how great he was at dominant masochistic activities. A nice offer, to be sure, but Bruno declined. Shocked and suddenly out of his depth, Remy panicked and attacked Bruno, eventually subduing him by hitting him over the head with a lamppost. Thinking he was dead, Remy stole the checkbook along with his ID and fled the apartment. But Bruno wasn't dead. A few days after the attack, Bruno came to in the hospital and became well enough to give a detailed description to police regarding the man who tried to kill him. A month later, Remy, using Bruno's checks and identity cards, made several purchases, including a new video camera and editing machine. He just couldn't let it go. The police had alerts placed on Bruno's bank accounts and were immediately notified when these purchases were made. A quick scan of the surveillance cameras revealed a man fitting the description that Bruno provided. Now they had a picture of Remy Waugh, and it wasn't long before they had a name to go with it. On November 28, 1991, Remy Waugh was arrested at his home. A search of the house turned up all the evidence they would need to convict him of multiple murders, including several pieces of the victim's property, blood evidence on articles of clothing, and of course, the Minitel machine. While incarcerated awaiting trial, Remy would confess to the murders and give a shocking explanation. He wasn't gay. Of course not. He was simply a homophobe who believed that gay men deserved to die. Whoa. When examined by a psychiatrist, Remy gave a laundry list of reasons for this hatred. His father was largely absent from his life, and his mother used violent disciplinary techniques, including beatings with a leather belt. As far as his raging homophobia, Remy cited several run-ins with gay men, amounting to bullying him for being straight, mistaking him for being gay and aggressively hitting on him, and the most explosive allegation of all, as a 17-year-old, he was attacked and gang raped by 4 men in Paris. All this was used at trial in an attempt to justify Remy's clearly psychotic behavior, but incredibly, every single one of his claims were thoroughly debunked by investigators, and his ultimate clinical diagnosis was that Remy Waugh suffered from sadistic, sadomasochistic fantasies that were ultimately impossible to ignore further, and he acted on them. He was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. So, hey, the Olympics are almost over. I really hope you've all enjoyed these episodes about the darker side of France. And, well, who knows, maybe I have one more in me. Thanks for listening, and please make sure you're following The Devil Within wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss an episode. You can also follow our socials at The Devil Within Pod on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. Until next time, stay safe out there. The Devil Within, recorded live at Bel Air Studios in Los Angeles, California. Written and produced by Brandon Morgan. Our post-production supervisor is Bruce Whitkin, who also provided original music for this episode. For The Devil Within, I'm your host, Brandon Morgan.